Hey guys, Nathan here. Absurd Being on Contributions to Philosophy. Heidegger. So we're still on the grounding. We talked about Dasein. That we talked about the grounding last time, but we just only discussed Dasein. Today we're going to finish the grounding. Hopefully, there's a lot of stuff to get through, but hopefully we can do it in one hit. So let's get straight into it. So language was what we're going to start with. So he talks about language understood originally or traditionally has been understood as assertion or statement. And this sees language as a present at hand object or a tool. And Heidegger wants to go beyond this. Much of his discussion on language, I mean, there isn't much here actually when he talks about language, and I don't think it really goes beyond anything that he's said in any other of the lectures or essays that we've covered before. But I'll just run through it anyway. So he says, well, there's a little bit. He says human beings are given concomitantly with language, so the two come at the same time. Language and the human being determine each other reciprocally. How does that become possible? Are they both in a certain respect the same, and in what respect are they so? In virtue of their belonging to being. So basically there we've covered Dasein as being appropriated by being, and Heidegger's asking here, what about language? How does language feature into this? And the two, he says, work together. Language and Dasein have this relationship, a close kind of connection in which they determine each other reciprocally. So neither one is more foundational than the other. And we normally think, right, language came after humans. Obviously, humans invented language. Heidegger would definitely disagree with that. The two are more closely intertwined in their origins, he thinks. But how does this become possible? How is it that they can both be the same? How can they both determine each other reciprocally? Because of their connection with being. So the essence of language is the naming that founds the truth of being. That's the key here. So language is if I can recall a word from Being and Time, equiprimordial, I think was the word he used, equiprimordial with Dasein. So it's working with Dasein to ground the truth of being. That's the idea here. And so we could say, what is language's contribution? How does language contribute to this? Well, it names beings. Language names beings, thereby allowing them to appear as what they are in the clearing which Dasein holds open. So obviously, right, I mean, you can't have language without human beings, without Dasein, but just as importantly, you can't have Dasein without language, because you can't have beings, right? So there's this, so the two work together, and that's not the way we typically think of things, but I think if you were to think about it in a bit more detail, you'd realize that it can't be any other way. It's not like there were things and we just came along and gave them names, right? The relationship to beings is deeper than that. Before they could even be beings, there had to be, language had to have contributed to that process, to the way in which beings appear as beings. So Heidegger's just making that point explicit here. Language is deeper than just assertion, just statement, just something that's a present at hand tool. It's foundational. Language worked with Dasein in order to effect being, which remember is an event, the event by which beings become beings in the first place. So that's language, not too much there. So now let's look at truth. And truth also, we don't really go that far beyond what we covered, particularly in the video series on the essence of truth. But there are a couple of new terms which it's worth looking at, and maybe slight refinement of points, refinement of Heidegger's thinking. So anyway, truth ordinarily is understood as correctness. Heidegger calls it correctness, and that's the rational conception of truth, where we have, or the most common philosophical term for this is correspondence theory of truth. Truth between propositions and beings, reality. Heidegger thinks that's a distortion of original truth. Again, we want to go below that, because in order for there to be that correspondence theory of that correspondence, truth as correspondence, you already need to have beings and propositions. And we want to go below that level. We want to figure out how there can be beings, or how it came about that there are beings in the first place, and propositions. So that's not kind of ultimate. It's just not. You haven't reached anything foundational with the correspondence theory of truth. So he gives us two aspects maybe to truth. The first he defines as the clearing for self-concealment, or even more simply, the clearing concealing. So that's the first aspect of truth. And he's quite specific about this. Those two terms go together. Truth is never merely clearing. It essentially occurs as concealment, just as originarily and intimately along with the clearing. These, clearing and concealment, are not two. Instead, they constitute the essential occurrence of the one truth itself. Okay, so concealment, we'll break these down. Concealment first, and then we'll look at clearing. So concealment is the way the inner recess always conceals itself at the same time that beings come to stand in it. So this idea of concealment, and when I say inner recess, I just mean truth. Actually, I really mean just truth. So concealment, the way that truth conceals itself at the same time that beings come to stand in it. And quite a simple idea, I think. Even as truth creates the space in which beings can first appear, truth itself necessarily disappears. That's basically the core. And if you think about it, like the analogy, I guess, is a pair of glasses, where in order for the glasses to do their job, to make your vision better, to allow beings to appear for you through vision, in order for that to happen, the glasses themselves must disappear. They must become invisible to you. You know, if you can see the glasses, then you're not seeing through the glasses. And the same principle holds here. In order for truth to work as an inner recess in which beings can first appear, truth itself, as what it is, must disappear. So Heidegger says, the essence of truth is untruth, where untruth is understood as concealing. The negative belongs intrinsically to truth, by no means as a sheer lack, but as resistance, as that self-concealing which comes into the clearing as such. So this is pretty much exactly what we already talked about in On the Essence of Truth, where Heidegger had that revelation, which I've heard it called, I've read it being called the revelation, whereby he which kind of set him off on his post being in time track. The idea that being itself is actually self-concealing. It never appears, just by nature of what it is, as glasses, as a pair of glasses. And remember so the idea here is just that being is a self-concealing, and that's the first of those terms, the clearing, concealing. The clearing, concealing, yeah. So we've got the concealing, we've got concealment. Sorry, I'm just trying to read through my notes. So that's concealment. The second part of that term, that phrase, was clearing. And what Heidegger means here is not clearing as in eliminating or getting rid of, but he says the clearing means precisely the grounding of the abyssal ground for the concealment. And without getting into too much detail about that, abyssal ground is a reference to time and space, I believe. And so essentially what he's saying is that time and space end up doing the concealing. It's kind of the way that truth conceals itself, I think. Anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail on that just yet. But the main point is that clearing isn't a clearing away. It's a grounding of the abyssal ground. It's a grounding of time and space, which affects the concealment that we're talking about, the concealment of truth. So that's clearing, concealment. That's the clearing, concealing aspect to truth. But there's also a second dimension that Heidegger talks about in regards to truth, and he talks about the essence of truth being openness, or the open realm. And so when we talk about truth as openness, we're talking about an inner recess, is another way that Heidegger describes this, and he compares it with the inside of a jug. So if you think about the inside of a jug, the inside is not just emptiness or nothingness. It's exactly what makes the jug what it is. It's what makes the jug useful. And he says the inner recess itself is what determines, shapes, and bears the walling action of the walls and of their surfaces. So it's like this space, although we're using the term metaphorically, obviously, space in which beings appear as beings, in which beings appear as the things that they are, whether they be things, tools, work, any of those things. Which is reasonably clear, I think. Truth is an openness. You have to have some open space in which beings can appear. But you might think, didn't we talk about this exact same thing in the last video with Dasein? Dasein as the site for the clearing of truth. Sorry, for the clearing of being. Didn't we had exactly the same metaphor, right? And in a way we do, and it is a little tough to tease apart these terms, these different terms that Heidegger comes up with, and they all seem to point back to being in a way. So it's like everything is being, truth is being, and Dasein's being. But I think if you do take the time, I think you can kind of make sense of all of these things, although they're all very similar and really closely related. You can separate them a little bit. So anyway, we've got this idea. Didn't Dasein do this already as sight? And we can think of Dasein, the there, as the surrounding, walling action. So it's the Dasein's like the outside of the jug, and truth is that inner recess. Truth is the inside of the jug, which is the space itself. So Dasein is kind of encloses that inner recess of truth. It's the holding open, which was a way that Heidegger described it, right? The holding open of this inner recess of truth. So that kind of dovetails quite nicely, I think. Okay, so that's truth. Now we've got truth. We had those two aspects of truth. Truth as clearing, concealing, and truth as openness. And if you think about it, those two are actually opposites, right? The concealment and openness. Those two, one is a hiding, and the other is a bringing forth, a showing. But again, if you recall the lecture Heidegger gave on the essence of truth, that's exactly how we ended up describing truth. We've got those two aspects. So maybe let me bring up this diagram, and we'll just have a quick look here. So just to refresh your memory, on the essence of truth, we talked about those. You've got correctness and incorrectness, and both of those are grounded in freedom, which was the essence of truth. And then freedom was grounded in a disclosive letting beings be, which was truth, and also in a concealing of beings as a whole, which was the untruth element. And both of those were grounded in a deeper, the one mystery, which we don't really need to worry with here. Heidegger doesn't mention so much in contributions. But if you have a look, what we're talking about when we talked about truth as clearing, concealing, we're looking at this blue section here, where truth is concealing. It's the untruth root of truth. Truth as concealing. And the other side, truth as openness, the disclosive letting beings be. So that's that orange section. And so I think this whole discussion on truth that we've looked at really just it kind of goes over covers the same ground, perhaps in a little bit more detail, certainly with new terms, with different terminology. But we can see that he's not, Heidegger he's not making the stuff up as he goes along. We can see a progression to his thought and the way his thought is kind of circling back over things that he's covered before, and perhaps drilling down a little bit deeper each time. So it's interesting. We can see kind of the evolution of Heidegger's thought as we go through his work in chronological sequence. So that's truth. There's one last thing I wanted to mention here, is that something about truth. Truth never is. Rather, it essentially occurs. And so this is another distinction Heidegger wants to make from the way that the truth as he means it versus the truth of correspondence theory, in which truth is like fact. It's something that exists. For him, it doesn't exist, it occurs. It's a process. And this is because truth is the truth of being with a Y, and being as event only essentially occurs. So truth is an event then, because it's associated with being. The way we're understanding it, the way we're looking at it, is a deeper level than the correspondence theory of truth. So the truth that we are investigating here is an event, not a propositional fact. And that is everything I have on truth. And so we're going to move into time and space. Unfortunately, it was really difficult to come to grips with anything that Heidegger says in contributions about time and space. I really didn't find him particularly lucid, or I didn't think he really explained much about them. But what I did get is what follows. So first thing, time and space, definitely not the scientific understandings we have, the scientific understanding of these terms, which sees time and space as themselves calculable and essentially empty frameworks for calculable and objectively present things. So science sees time and space as these frameworks within which things happen, but time and space themselves are essentially empty. For Heidegger, time space, which is the way I'll describe it, and I write it time hyphen space. So time space is more originary, and that's another Heidegger term there. So science, the idea again that science isn't wrong though in having this, in treating space and time in these terms. It's just not at the level where we're looking. It's just a limited, more restricted sense. Heidegger wants something more fundamental, more foundational than what science is capable of. And he also talks about the fact that primordial temporality is not lived time, in the same way that spatiality is not the spatiality of the subject or the I. And that's, again, this is another way in which Heidegger's post-being and time thought has really evolved in quite a different way from it was in Being and Time. And where in Being and Time there was a lot of, it was almost time and space were linked and connected to an experiencing subject. And so Heidegger really wants to draw that distinction in contributions, and maybe this is but this is definitely one of the takeaway points regarding time and space here. He's moving away from that phenomenological existential treatment that he gave them in Being and Time, and we're getting at something more originary, more fundamental, and connecting time space with being. So that's kind of what time space isn't. What is time space? He calls them together the abyssal ground, which I referenced just before when we're talking about truth. And he says they're the first essential occurrence of the ground. So it grounds in the mode of temporalization and spatialization. The abyssal ground, that is. But the abyssal ground grounds in the mode of temporalization and spatialization. And when I say that, the abyssal ground grounds, what I mean is in the sense of allowing the ground to occur as ground, if that makes sense. Lots of grounds in there. But the way I read that is that Heidegger's then saying time-space is in a sense deeper than truth, because it grounds truth. So perhaps to put it crudely, we might have, if we can imagine, a chain of events, which is certainly not the way Heidegger would recommend, would want to express it. But we can just, for our own understanding, we could think of it as starting with the event, which is being, and this grounds time-space, which in turn grounds truth as that concealing, the clearing concealing that we talked about just before. And what's interesting about that, actually, I just thought of this just before, is that if the abyssal ground grounds truth in the sense that truth is a concealing, what we have is this idea that truth conceals itself through time and space. So time and space are like the glasses through which we can we see the clearing in which beings can appear as beings, i.e. truth. So I don't know, that's an interesting thought. So because of time and space, truth is concealed. Anyway, I thought that was just an interesting thing that really just popped into my head just before. So abyssal ground is characterized by what Heidegger calls the hesitant self-withholding. So this is another term to grapple with. And we'll break it down. It's hesitant and self-withholding. So first of all, let's have a look at the self-withholding. What does that mean? And I'm going to hit massive quotes with these terms, because the reason is it's just so hard to get a handle on them. So I'm just going to throw it all up there and let you struggle with it yourself to a certain degree. So anyway, self-withholding. The self-withholding creates not only the emptiness of privation and austerity, but also along with these, an emptiness as one that is in itself transporting, i.e. transporting into the to come, and thereby simultaneously bursting open what has been. This abandonment, however, because it originarily occurs as remembering and expecting, is the present, the moment, which is raised up and is directed out only toward the decision. Incorporated into the moment are all the transportings, and the moment itself essentially occurs merely as the gathering of the transportings. The remembering expectation brings up for decision the question of whether or not being intrudes. So like I said, I'm just going to throw it and pretty much just leave it at that, because I don't know if you can make more sense of that than I can, but it's just not that clear to me when I read that. What I did get from that, well, if I can just take a step back, think about the term self-withholding. In a way, it kind of sounds a little bit temporal to me. It sounds like we are trying to get to time. And the way that it seems that way, if I was thinking about this last night, imagine things on an escalator where, and so things, not human beings, but imagine things on an escalator just kind of moving forward. And so there's this idea that the things themselves are moving from, say, past to where they are now, the present, and where they will be in the future. So we have this kind of temporal stream, if you like. But because there is nothing that's aware of it, the thing, whatever, let's say it's a jug on the escalator, the jug's not aware of any of this happening. It's not aware of where it was and the fact that it is here now and the fact that it's going to be over there later. So time, temporality, doesn't actually exist. And Sartre made the same explicit point. Time doesn't, there is no temporality for being in itself. The temporality only comes into the world through the for itself. And so that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about this. Things on an escalator moving along. So temporality, this movement from past to present to future, it's not a being, it's not something. And that's the way science treats it. Something, stick it in an equation, T. It's the T in the equation. It's a container, if you like. In physics, they often talk about it as space-time, as this four-dimensional block, right? So that's not what we're getting at here. Space-time, when we're talking about time here, temporality isn't something. It's not a being. It's what happens to these beings, and self-withholding. Then the way this comes in is that there is no temporality when we've got this jug moving along on its escalator. But when suddenly a being appears which can kind of withhold, which can kind of pull itself back from this process, from this automatic process, and see it unfolding, then we have temporality, and that's what temporality is. So that's when I think about self-withholding. It just seems like it can quite nicely capture this idea of temporality. Maybe I'm being too generous, but that's kind of how I think about it when I think about this word self-withholding. So what else did we get from that passage? The emptiness created in the self-withholding is a transporting, and that's a key term which I think occurs later in Heidegger as well. He talks about temporality in terms of transporting. So that's a new term that we need to become familiar with. And a transporting into a to come and a what has been. So again, just it's kind of a nice way of putting it, really. Transporting, temporality is a transporting into the future and the past, using different terms, just really, I think, to effect a break from everything that came before him. So we're not talking about the future as in the way that science would think of it, for example, or a past which has gone, has forever, it doesn't exist anymore, but existed at one point, something like that. Where Heidegger's just wants to completely reorient us to temporality, and again, this is just another. I keep saying again, and this is another way, another example of moving from the first beginning to the other beginning. The first beginning ended up treating temporality in this way. Now we wanted to come back and experience it in a different way, and so we need different terms. We need different terminology in order to do that. So I think that's why he's talking about a to come and a what has been, rather than past and the future, rather than the future and the past. And so anyway, we've got this idea of self-withholding, temporality as a transporting into a to come and a what has been, and it occurs as remembering and expecting in a moment, which is where the decision happens. And that term, remember, decision carries a kind of special import for Heidegger. And moment also is worth dwelling on for a moment. So Heidegger goes on to say that moment is by no means merely an infinitesimal, scarcely graspable remnant of time. And that's the way the present is treated, right? We typically think of the present as like a vanishing point with no temporal dimension. It's just like the place where past and future meet, but it has no depth itself. So Heidegger's definitely not having that. Rather, the moment has takes kind of has a central role in Heidegger's philosophy, because time-space unfolds as the sight of the moment of the event. The sight of the moment of the event. So moment is really closely bound up with being itself, with the event of being. Like I say, I don't think I couldn't get much more than that, but that's kind of we're starting out on the road to some understanding. But that's all I got from that self-withholding. And we can also look at the hesitant part of that description of time-space. So time-space is hesitant self-withholding. What does the hesitant mean? Another quote, let me hit you with it. Yet what withholds itself does so in a hesitant way, and thereby grants the possibility of bestowal and appropriation. The self-withholding dispenses the transporting, which is characteristic of temporalizing, but as hesitant. It is also the most originary captivation of things. This captivation is the embrace in which the moment and thus the temporalization are held fast, like the originary abyssal ground, emptiness, neither that nor fullness. This captivation also makes possible a bestowal as an essential possibility, grants bestowal a space. The captivation is the spatialization of the event. Same as before, right? I mean, whatever you can get out of that, congratulations or good luck. What I did manage to decipher, as to the extent I can call it deciphering, is so we've seen that time space is temporal in the way that it opens up kind of room in which existence acquires a transported or spread out quality, from a preserving past to an anticipated future. And now, with this hesitancy, time-space is spatial, acquires its spatiality as a consequence of a hesitancy in this transporting, which somehow, although I don't think Heidegger explains it, somehow spatializes the event, giving us extension. So hesitance, so the you've got the transporting of temporality, but that transporting is hesitant in some way, and in some way that hesitancy gives us spatiality. So those two terms, when we're talking about time space, they're hesitant, self-withholding. Self-withholding seems to apply to temporality, or seems to relate to temporality, describe temporality, whereas the hesitancy, that hesitant half of the equation, describes spatiality. So, yeah, take from there what you will, or what you can. What we can definitely say is that time and space for Heidegger are very closely intertwined. And he says each belongs intrinsically to the other, even though they are not of the same essence. So they're different in their at their core, in their essence, but they still belong to each other. And one way I was able to well, I think one way I caught this interconnection between the two is when he talks about time-space in terms of constancy and presence. Two more terms which we can all struggle with when we try and understand Heidegger here. And I'm going to give you another quote, yet another one. This is the last one, but it's another lengthy one. Constancy is the enduring of the transporting into the having been and into the to come, and duration as mere continuance is only a consequence of this endurance. Presence is the present in the sense of the gatheredness of the enduring in accord with the withdrawal of the latter out of the transportings. Grasped spatially, constancy is the filling and fulfilling of space, space that is not explicitly experienced, and thus is a granting of place. Presence is a granting of place in the sense of giving space for beings which are put back into presence and thus are constant. Okay. So from there, so we've got these two terms, constancy and presence. And basically Heidegger is explaining time and space through these two terms, constancy and presence, which apply to both halves of that equation, time and space. So if we take the temporal side first, temporally speaking, constancy is the way the transporting manifests before us, while presence is the way this transporting is gathered and acquires some density, for want of a better word, in the present. So constancy and presence have this temporal dimension, but they also have a spatial dimension in which constancy establishes space as a background, which is not explicitly experienced, and presence establishes space in the sense of a place for beings. So again, to repeat myself, that constancy and presence both have a temporal application and also a spatial application, but that that principle, or that fact, emphasizes the connection between the two, just how closely intertwined time and space are for Heidegger. Okay, that's pretty much all I could get for that, so I'm just going to leave it there. Really, I don't think Heidegger explained time and space that well in Contributions. Maybe we can get a better, more fuller explanation in some later work, but from Contributions, that's what I was able to get. So anyway, thanks for listening again. Hopefully this is all coming together in some kind of coherent way. Yeah, I'll see you in the next video, when we'll keep going. In the next video we look at the future ones and the last God. So that'll be interesting. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you soon. Whoa, stop. I forgot to summarize this video. So I better do that now. So let's just have a quick look at this. First up, we talked about language today, and the way language works with Dasein and allowing beings to be named, thereby helping found the truth of being. We also looked at truth, and specifically those two dimensions of truth, truth as clearing for self-concealment, which was the untruth in the essence of truth, and also openness, truth as openness, which was the truth, the unconcealing dimension to truth. And finally we looked at time and space, or time-space, which Heidegger calls the abyssal ground. We looked briefly at how that might, how it grounds truth as unconcealing, and how it grounds truth as concealing, as the self-concealing, and the way that it may act as a pair of glasses was the analogy, the pair of glasses in which we see through, but which allows truth to be self-concealing in the first place. And we looked at it as a hesitant self-withholding, the way that self-withholding refers to the temporal, and the hesitant refers to the spatial dimension. And we saw that both closely interconnected, and we looked at how that relationship through those two new terms, constancy and presence. So that is the finish. So I'm definitely going to sign off this time, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.